Hi, I'm Maxine Hong Kingston, and my mother and father, Tom Hong and Chuling Yang, were both Chinese immigrants. They operated a gambling house in California. I was born in 1940, and shortly after, my parents moved into the laundry business. I had 5 brothers and sisters who helped work at the laundry store, working very long hours. I attended public schools, where I became an excellent student. When I graduated high school, I went to Berkeley with the help of 11 scholarships. My first major was engineering, but later changed it to English literature. I graduated Berkeley with a bachelor's degree in 1962. The same year, I married Earl Kingston. Man, was he a stud. Anyways, after graduating from Berkeley, I started to teach a high school in Hayward, California. 2 years later, I moved to Hawaii, where I taught a private boarding school. In 1976, my first published work was A Woman Warrior, Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Goods. I won the National Book Critics Circle Award and became a literary celebrity when I was 36 years old. The book reflects a lot about my childhood. You can see that I have written a lot about my struggles, such as being a Chinese woman in American society. I wrote this book to show what Chinese women encounter in their lifetime. As you can see in my book, I have written about my experiences at the laundromat and learning to live with my mother. You probably have noticed that I left male characters out of my book. I did this to emphasize what I went through as a Chinese girl. I also highlighted my mother's life as well as my aunt's life because I wanted to show not only what I went through, but what my mother and aunt went through as well. Overall, I just wanted to show the world what it was like to grow up as a Chinese woman in America.
This is a summary of The Woman Warrior. This novel, only 5 chapters long, tells the stories of 5 women through talk stories. Kingston's dead aunt, Moaning Woman, a mythical female warrior, Fa Mulan, Kingston's mother, Brave Orchid, another of Kingston's aunts, Moon Orchid, and Kingston herself. The first chapter, entitled Moaning Woman, is about an aunt that Kingston never had the opportunity to know. Kingston's mother tells her the story as a deliberate warning of how this aunt brought disgrace upon her family by having an illegitimate child. The aunt killed herself and her baby by jumping into the well after she had given birth. Kingston is warned to never mention this aunt, for she has been forgotten and disowned by her family. Kingston does not know the actual story behind the events leading up to her aunt's suicide, so she decides to create the story herself. She imagines her aunt attracting a male, perhaps in her community, believing that her aunt's rebellion matched that of her own. She also imagines that her aunt's ghost was walking around with no one to give it gifts, as it was Chinese tradition to do so for respected ancestors who have passed away. The second chapter, entitled White Tigers, is about the mythical warrior Fa Mulan. Fa Mulan trains to become a warrior from a young age and eventually leads an army of men in her father's stead. She heroically pretends to be a man herself as she goes against the emperor of her land. After the battle, she returns home to live as a wife and mother. Through this myth, Kingston realizes that her weapons are her knowledge, her wit, and her words. The third chapter, entitled Shaman, is about Kingston's mother, Brave Orchid. She was a midwife, a doctor, and a woman with the ability to destroy ghosts in her village when she was young. Her mother tells her stories of slave girls being bought and sold, a woman stoned to death, and Chinese babies left to die. These stories haunt Kingston for many years. Kingston and her mother have not had a great mother-daughter relationship, but after many years of being away, she returns to visit her mother. This visit is renewing, and Brave Orchid shows her daughter the love that she has held from her for years. The fourth chapter, entitled At the Western Place, is about Moon Orchid, Kingston's aunt. The chapter starts out with another story that Brave Orchid is telling Kingston. The story is about an emperor who had 4 wives. Moon Orchid had a similar situation. Her husband had left her behind in China and remarried in America. Brave Orchid forces her sister to go to demand from her husband what he owes her as his wife. Moon Orchid eventually loses her mind and dies in a California mental institution. The fifth and final chapter, entitled A Song for a Barbarian Reed Pipe, is about Kingston herself. She tells of her childhood and teenage years and of her anger and frustration in trying to please her loving mother. She also tells us about how she bullied a young Chinese girl and how she erupted in anger at her mother after an unsuccessful try at calmly explaining her frustration. At the end of this chapter, Kingston has come to appreciate her mother and what she has taught her through her little stories. She ventures out to tell her own little story about a warrior poetess who is captured by barbarians who returns to her people with songs from a far-off land. Kingston has finally found her harmony in her culture and in her own world.
Kingston's the main character of her book, The Woman Warrior.
In The Woman Warrior, she tells her story as well as her mother's and aunt's story. She uses other underdeveloped characters like Fa Mulan and the aunt with no name to help the audience understand where she comes from. All the characters in the book are used to show the audience Kingston's growth. The beginning of the book starts off with Kingston as a young girl. Her mother tells her the story of Kingston's aunt who shamed their family. The young Kingston develops intricate stories about her aunt to show the reader that she was creative and curious as a young girl. At the end of this chapter, Kingston speaks to us as an adult, telling us that she doesn't even know her aunt's story. However, I feel like she identified with her aunt because her aunt had to accept her place as a Chinese girl. By writing about this aunt, I think she felt like she gave her aunt what she deserved, simply just some recognition after all those years of denying her existence. I think this was also her rebellious side coming out because she wasn't supposed to talk about her aunt. In the next chapter, White Tiger, Kingston disappears into the story of Fa Mulan. She uses I when talking about Fa Mulan, which shows how she yearned to be a woman warrior. She put Fa Mulan's story into her book to show the reader her admiration for her. Kingston even says, "My American life has been such a disappointment." Going from a story about the warrior woman to saying how her life was disappointing shows us that she compares her life to Fa Mulan. Even as an adult, she wished to escape into the fantasy of being a woman warrior. At work with her racist boss, she wishes she could be a woman warrior. If I took this sword, which my hate surely have forged out of the air and gutted him, I would put color and wrinkles into his shirt. This also shows Kingston isn't courageous to stand up for herself. She only thinks about standing up to him, but never does. In the third chapter, Shaman, Kingston also disappears into her mother's story of becoming a doctor. But this time, she doesn't use I when referring to her mother, but tells her mother's story from her point of view. Her mother, Brave Orchard, is the next developed character. Brave Orchard is very faithful to her heritage, meaning she knows how to stay connected with her culture even though she is thousands of miles away from her country. When she comes to the United States, being Chinese is all she knows, so she holds on to that. One example of this is how she calls all the Americans ghosts. While at the airport to pick up her sister, she spots the suitcase inspector ghost and the customs ghost. To her, the Americans aren't even people, but they are ghosts. This shows that she doesn't want to accept that she is now an American and won't be returning to China. Brave Orchard is also guarded. She only brings up information that is important. Like when she told her daughter, Kingston, about her aunt, whom they should not speak of. On top of being guarded, she is demanding. She demands her children and her sister. One example in the book is when she demanded her sister to claim her husband and what was hers. Her sister Moon Orchard is the other developed character in the story. While Brave Orchard is overpowering, Moon Orchard is feeble. She let her sister boss her around. This might be because Moon Orchard was in China longer than Brave Orchard, and Moon Orchard has learned to take orders from everyone, whereas Brave Orchard has to learn how to stand up for herself and her family when they come to the United States. Notice how all of the characters in the story are women. This is probably because Kingston wanted to focus on the suffering of the Chinese American woman.